Under the pale glow of a harvest moon, the prairie slept uneasy. Wind hissed through the dry grass, whispering across the old ranch like the breath of something waiting to happen.
Ow.
The cattle had gone quiet hours ago, the horses restless in their stalls. It was the kind of silence that made a soul hold its breath, the kind that came before something broke loose. Out by the wooden corral, a woman knelt alone in the dirt, her dress torn by the wind, her eyes fixed on the men closing in from the darkness. They came slow, boots crunching on the brittle ground, guns hanging from belts and whiskey on their breath. Their shadows stretched long under the lantern light swinging from the post. One of them spat and called her name, voice thick with hate and something meaner than fear. She didn't move. Her hands trembled against the cold earth, but her chin stayed high. There was no one left to call for her, no one she trusted behind those walls. The ranch she had worked on, lived on, was no longer a place of safety. They blamed her for what had happened the night before, the fire that took the stable, the wounded man, the vanished horses. In truth, she had only tried to protect what little she had left. But in these parts, a woman alone had few chances to prove her innocence. The law was a day's ride away, and the men from the ranch carried their own brand of justice. The leader, broad-shouldered and cruel-eyed, stopped a few paces from her. His boots kicked up a small cloud of dust that drifted in the still night. "You should have run while you had the chance," he said, voice low, roughened by years of command. The others spread around him like wolves circling a wounded deer. The lantern's light danced across their faces, hard and unforgiving. She didn't answer. Her throat burned. Her heart beat loud enough she thought they might hear it. She knew begging wouldn't help. Not with these men. Not after what they'd seen near the canyon hoofprints mixed with bare feet, and the strange arrow lodged in a fence post. They believed she'd helped him. The Apache. Rumors had spread for months. An unseen warrior haunting the ranch trails, moving silent as smoke, taking back what the settlers had stolen. The men called him a ghost, some said a devil. She had seen him once, at dusk, near the river bend. His eyes had met hers across the water, fierce and watchful, like a wild thing deciding whether to strike or spare. Now, under the same moon, she felt that memory press against her heart. She could almost hear the whisper of the wind through his bowstring, the promise of something both terrifying and merciful. Still, she told herself he wouldn't come. Not tonight, not for her. The leader stepped closer, drawing his revolver. "You brought this on yourself," he said, raising the gun until the barrel caught the moonlight. Her breath caught in her chest. The other men shifted uneasily, the moment thick with the weight of what was about to happen. Then, a sound cut through the air, soft at first, like the sigh of the wind. The horses snorted and stomped. The lantern flickered. Every man froze. From the dark beyond the fence, a shape moved. Shadows bent around it, slow and deliberate. He stepped into the open, tall and bare-chested, his skin painted with ash and ochre. The firelight caught the sharp edge of muscle and the glint of an arrowhead drawn tight against a bowstring. His eyes, dark as riverstone, fixed on the man holding the gun. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to stop. The Apache warrior stood silent, steady as a mountain. He didn't shout or warn. His presence alone was enough to make the night feel smaller, the air tighter. The bow in his hands was drawn, the arrow ready, the fletching trembling just slightly under the tension. One of the ranchmen cursed and reached for his weapon, but the leader hissed for silence. He knew this wasn't a ghost. It was flesh and blood, and that made him far more dangerous. The Apache's reputation had spread across the frontier like wildfire. Stories told in taverns and whispered in camps spoke of him how he'd tracked down a dozen raiders through desert storms. How he could move unseen, even with the moon high above. Some called him a hunter, others a protector. The woman's eyes met his, and for a heartbeat, the world around them disappeared. She saw no rage there, only a calm that seemed born from something older than the land itself. He looked at her, then at the men, as if measuring what must be done. The leader tightened his grip on the pistol. "This ain't your fight, savage," he growled, his voice breaking the stillness. But the Apache didn't move, didn't lower the bow. The arrow's tip glimmered just above the woman's shoulder, aimed at the man who dared step forward. The wind picked up again, carrying the dry scent of dust and wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried. The ranch hands glanced at each other, uncertainty creeping into their faces. The man with the gun shifted his stance, but his hand trembled ever so slightly. The Apache's gaze didn't waver. Every heartbeat felt stretched thin, caught between decision and disaster. Then the warrior spoke, his voice low, calm, steady, like running water. "Go," he said. "Before the earth remembers your steps." The words hung in the air, simple and final. The men hesitated, torn between pride and fear. One of them muttered that there were more of them than him, but no one moved to test it. The Apache's eyes made it clear. If one fell, so would the rest. The woman still knelt in the dirt, unable to speak. She wanted to thank him, to plead for him to leave before they regrouped, but her voice wouldn't come. The leader spat on the ground and stepped back, glaring at her with a promise that this wasn't over. Slowly, one by one, the men retreated into the shadows they had come from, their boots crunching against the gravel until the sound was swallowed by the wind. When the last one was gone, the Apache lowered his bow. He didn't come closer right away, only watched her as if making sure she wasn't harmed. The silence between them carried more than words ever could, fragile understanding born in danger and trust. Finally, he turned to leave, fading back toward the line of trees beyond the fence. She rose, her knees weak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Wait," she said. He stopped, but didn't turn. "Oh, why did you help me?" He paused, his head slightly tilted as if listening to something far away. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but certain. "Because they fear what they don't understand," he said, "and you are not one of them." Then he vanished into the dark, leaving her alone beneath the restless moon. She stood there long after he was gone, the sound of his words echoing inside her chest. Somewhere in the distance, the wind carried the faint cry of an owl, and she knew this wasn't the end. The men would return. The ranch would not forget. But neither would she. Because tonight the shadows had chosen a side and it wasn't theirs. And as dawn began to stretch pale fingers over the horizon, a new question burned in her mind. What debt did she now owe to the Apache, who had stepped out of the night to save her life? The morning after the Apache warrior vanished into the darkness, the ranch felt heavier than ever. The woman woke to a silence that seemed unnatural, the kind that pressed against her ears until even her own heartbeat sounded too loud. The men were gone from the yard, but their tracks still marked the dust, circling the spot where she had knelt the night before. Every print told the story of fear and hesitation, of something they didn't understand but would not forget. She walked toward the corral, her boots brushing the dry grass, her hands trembling with the memory of the arrow drawn in her defense. The smell of smoke lingered faintly in the air from the fire that had started days ago. The wind carried the scent of scorched wood mixed with the earth's dust, as if the land itself refused to let her forget. Inside the barn, morning light filtered through the cracks in the boards, cutting the shadows into sharp, thin lines. She paused where the horses had once been, tracing her fingers over the empty stalls. Only one mare remained, a pale, nervous creature with a scar across her flank. The woman whispered softly to calm her, though her own voice quivered. "Ow." The mare shifted but didn't bolt. Somehow she too seemed to sense that danger was still close. By mid-morning, the foreman returned with 2 of his men. They didn't speak much to her, only through her brief, hard looks before heading into the main house. She could hear their muffled voices behind the door, accusations, arguments, talk of revenge. The leader's tone carried through clearly, sharp, and impatient. He wasn't one to let things rest, and the sight of that Apache standing against them had cut at his pride. She knew it was only a matter of time before they rode out to find him. All day she worked quietly, mending fences, fetching water, keeping her head down. But her thoughts wouldn't settle. Every time the wind stirred, she thought she saw a shadow move near the tree line. Every creak of the barn made her turn. It wasn't fear, it was something else, something harder to name. That night, when the sun dipped behind the hills and the ranch lights flickered to life, she sat by the well staring at the horizon. The moon rose, pale and distant, silvering the dust that floated in the air. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called out, its cry thin and lonely. She listened, wondering if he was out there too, the man who had stepped from the dark like a spirit of the wild. She didn't know his name, didn't know what tribe he belonged to, or what brought him near the ranch. But she remembered his eyes, how calm they were, even with 5 guns pointed at him. There was no hatred in them, only something that looked like understanding. When she finally went inside, she found the leader waiting by the door. He leaned against the frame, a bottle in his hand, his face drawn tight with sleeplessness. "He's one of them Apaches from the northern valley," he said without looking at her. "They've been moving closer to the river again. I told the sheriff we'd handle it ourselves." She froze. "You don't have to go after him," she said quietly. He laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You think he'll just walk away after tonight? You think he came to save you out of kindness?" "No. He's scouting, same as the rest of them. Next time there'll be more." She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but she saw the fury burning behind his words. To him, every Apache was an enemy, every silence a threat. That night, she couldn't sleep. The memory of the arrow still burned in her mind. It wasn't fear she felt, it was a question she couldn't shake. Why had he risked himself for her? What did he see that made him step into that ring of danger? When dawn came, the men saddled their horses and rode out. She watched from the porch, her hands clasped tightly around a mug gone cold. The leader met her gaze once before turning away, his eyes filled with a promise she didn't want to understand. Hours passed. The sky turned from gold to gray as clouds gathered over the ridge. The air smelled like rain but held no relief. She went about her chores again, though her thoughts stayed fixed on the forest line where the men had disappeared. By sunset, the first one came back, alone. His face was pale, his sleeve torn, his eyes hollow. He didn't speak as he rode past her, only looked at her once, like a man who had seen something that couldn't be spoken. Behind him, two more followed, leading a riderless horse. The saddle was bloodied, and no one asked whose it was. The leader didn't return. That night, the wind rose fierce, rattling the shutters and howling through the cracks of the old barn. She sat by the small fire in her cabin, staring at the flames. The sound of hooves came again, distant at first, then closer. She stood quickly, her heart pounding. When the door creaked open, she expected one of the men, but it was him. The Apache. His shoulders were wet from the rain, his bow slung across his back. He stepped inside without a word, and for a moment all she could do was stare. He looked at her with the same steady calm as before. "They followed me," he said quietly. "Your leader would not turn back." She swallowed hard. He didn't make it back. He nodded once, as if he had expected it, chose the path himself. For a long time, neither spoke. The rain fell harder outside, drumming against the roof. He glanced toward the fire, then back at her. "They will come again," he said. "Others from the ranch. They will not forgive what they think happened." She sank slowly onto the bench near the fire. "Then what am I supposed to do?" He hesitated before answering. "Leave. Before dawn. Go east where the land is still empty. There is a river that runs beyond the hills. No one will follow you there." Her throat tightened. "And you?" "I will stay," he said. "There are things that must be finished." She watched him, the flicker of the firelight painting shadows across his face. There was something about his stillness, like he carried the memory of too many storms. She wanted to ask what had made him this way, what had drawn him near her ranch, but something in his eyes told her not to. Some truths were carved too deep to be spoken aloud. When he turned to leave, she found herself reaching out. "Wait," she whispered. "If I go, will they stop?" He paused in the doorway. "They will stop fearing what they cannot find," he said. "But they will never stop hating what they do not understand." Then he was gone again, swallowed by the rain and darkness. That night she packed what little she owned, a blanket, a loaf of bread, a knife, and her father's old compass. But when morning came, she couldn't bring herself to leave. Something in her heart kept her tied to the place, to the man who had appeared like a phantom and spoken to her like she still had a choice. Days passed. The men buried their leader near the western fence, the spot where the land met the dry gulch. No one spoke much after that. The ranch grew quieter, the workers fewer. Some said the place was cursed. Others whispered that the Apache had marked it, that his spirit lingered in the hills. She didn't believe in curses. But sometimes, at night, when the fire burned low and the wind brushed through the grass, she thought she saw him again standing at the edge of the trees, watching. Not as a ghost, but as a guardian. And though she couldn't explain why, she began leaving food near the fence. A piece of bread, a strip of dried meat, a flask of water. She never saw him take it, but each morning it was gone. Something was changing in the valley. The men from neighboring ranches spoke of missing cattle, of strange tracks near the streams. The word Apache was whispered again, sharper this time, carrying the promise of another conflict. She felt it to the land, holding its breath, waiting. Somewhere beyond those hills, the warrior was moving, unseen but not forgotten. And though fear still lingered in her heart, so did something else. A sense that their stories had only just begun. Rain gave way to dust again, and the valley woke to a hard, bright sun that showed every scar on the land. The woman rose before the rooster and walked the fence line with the pale mare, tracing the breaks where wire had been cut and posts left to lean. Each gap told a story, though none of them were simple. Some were sharp and deliberate as a knife. Others looked like the slow work of age and wind. She fixed what she could, tied what she couldn't, and kept thinking of the bow that had drawn a line in the night between mercy and ruin. The old American frontier had a way of stripping a soul to its choices, and she could feel hers coming closer with every step. The ranch fell quiet in the days after the burial, but quiet didn't mean peace. Men muttered in corners and paused when she walked by. New riders came and went, hard-eyed strangers who studied the hills instead of the herd. A pair of them rode out each morning toward the river, always returning near dusk with nothing to show but dust on their coats and frustration in their jaws. The word Apache hung in the air like smoke, catching in throats, stinging eyes, never truly seen, yet always there. She moved through it like a shadow, careful with her words, careful with her face. One afternoon, a young hand knocked at her door with his hat in both hands. He stood on the stoop like someone who had run out of places to put his fear. Said the new riders weren't cowmen at all. Said they wore plain coats, but carried rifles stamped with an army mark. He said he had heard talk of a clean sweep of the valley. Spoke fast, as if speaking itself might summon a bullet. She listened without interrupting, and then asked if anyone else knew. He shook his head and asked her what to do. She had no answer that would not end in blood. She told him to sleep in the hayloft that night and leave at dawn with the mare to the mining road, to follow the ridge and not look back. He left without another word. Later, she tucked bread and water in the loft and a note she could not sign. She stood in the barn doorway and watched the light die on the far hills, telling herself that saving a single soul was still worth something, even if the world burned down around it. When darkness pooled in the yard, she went to the fence where she had been leaving food. The ground held no tracks, yet every offering had vanished like dew and sun. She set down a small bundle and waited with her back to the post. The moon climbed, and the wind turned cool. Owls hunted in the trees. The steady breath of the prairie folded over her like a blanket. She almost drifted when a shape blurred the corner of her sight, a darker sliver moving among dark trunks. She didn't turn. She only said that the ranch was bringing in guns, and that the river would run red if no one stopped them. The night made no answer. She felt a presence pass behind her like the pull of a tide, and when she looked down, the bundle was gone. By morning, the hired rifles rode west to comb the scrub and gullies beyond the corral. Their leader now was a spare man with eyes like flint and a voice that never rose. He drew a map in the dirt for the others, a crude circle around the high creek and the willow flats. The woman studied the marks and saw at once that the circle cut through a place where the valley narrowed, where water, trail, and wind all pinched into a small throat of land. It looked like a snare. She said nothing. The sheriff came at noon with a thin deputy and a canvas bag that clinked. He walked through the ranch house, counting doorways and windows like a buyer. He took coffee on the porch and asked cold questions about the fire, about the stolen horses, about why the ranch hands had buried their boss without him. He never once asked if she was safe. She realized then that law in this place had become a garment you wore when it suited, and a rag you threw away when it didn't. Old words like treaty and border and promise had been rubbed thin as paper. That evening, she rode the pale mare to the ridge and looked down at the river country. Cottonwoods lifted their hands to a sky full of swallows. The water ran narrow but fast, bright where it broke over stone, dark where it bent into shadow. She found a high lookout above the willow flats and waited until the sun slid behind the rim. A red fox trotted along the shore. A heron shook water from its wings. Then a figure rose from the reeds as if the river had grown him from root and silt. The Apache warrior stood with his back to the dying light, watching the far bank. He did not turn when she approached. She stopped a dozen paces away and climbed down, keeping her hands where he could see them. She told him the rifles planned to drive him into the Narrows. He said he knew. She said they wanted to burn the flats to smoke out anyone hiding there. Said the water was too quick for fire to find a grip. Said the sheriff would turn a blind eye when it started. He said the sheriff had already done so. The quiet between them was not empty. It held the low rush of the river and the clack of dry reeds and the faint hush of birds turning in air. It felt like standing inside a bow before the string is loosed. He asked why she had not fled when he told her to. She said the ranch was still her work and her burden. She said leaving would only make the men meaner. She said she had seen what anger without a witness could do. His eyes softened at that, a warmth like banked coals. He said the valley once held winter huts and summer camps, and children learned to swim in the deep bends and elders told stories by the fire where willow meets sage. He said the river carried songs into the canyon and carried them back again. When the first settlers came, there was space for both kinds of living. Then more came, then fences, and promises that bent like wire in heat. He said he had tried to keep his people to the north, but the drought had bitten into the hills, and the cattle had stripped the grass to its roots. They moved closer not to conquer but to drink. She heard truth there, the kind that stings more than a lie. She said the ranch was dying too. Cattle had gone missing, water had dropped low, and the owner now in the ground had borrowed money from men who carried ledgers like guns. Behind the talk of Apache and theft and revenge stood another shadow with a city suit and a deed book. The valley had become a balance sheet, and everyone in it a figure to be crossed out if the sum looked wrong. They stood at the water's edge as the last light bled away. He said the hired rifles would push south in the morning. He would not meet them there. He would draw them west, into the broken country where the ground hides its edges. He said his people would move that night, women and children first, from the Willow Flats to the high ridge above the canyon. He asked her to make the ranch busy at dawn, to kick up enough dust that riders might hesitate. She almost laughed at the madness of it. But the plan had the clean ring of necessity, and necessity was the only law that still worked. She returned near midnight by a long path, and found the young hand gone from the loft and the mare's feed barely touched. A good sign. In the dark of the kitchen, she filled sacks with grain and hung wet sheets along the clothesline to catch morning light and make the yard look crowded. She pulled tools from their places and set them out as if a dozen workers had just stepped away. When the first gray line of dawn slid over the ridge, the ranch already looked alive. The rifles gathered at the gate, impatient at the bustle. The spare man told her to keep out from underfoot. She asked him if he planned to bring anyone back in one piece. He stared so long she thought he had not heard. Then he said he planned to bring back quiet, which was all a ranch ever needed. He split the men into 2 lines and took the Willow Flats first, just as the dirt map had promised. The woman saddled a mule and followed at a distance with a crate that rattled like iron. She kept to the sage in the shadow of small hills. The trail cut into the Narrows and then climbed toward the scrub mesas. Hours passed in a sun that burned without mercy. Vultures traced slow circles over the heat. Far ahead, riders crossed a ridge and dropped out of sight, dust hanging above them like a torn flag. She stopped short of the ridge and unpacked the crate. Inside lay branding irons and chains and a hammer wrapped in canvas. Her hands shook as she spread them on the ground. She had told the warriors she could make the ranch busy. She had not told him how. She set the irons in a fire she built from dry brush, then dragged the chains into the dust so they left marks like the scuffle of many feet. She struck the hammer on stone until the sound rolled into the next hollow, like work in a forge. The trick worked on cattle, on men, and on fear. Noise breeds numbers when heard from far away. From the ridge came a distant shout, then another. The rifles had found something. She banked the fire and crawled to a notch in the rocks. Across the valley, scattered riders drew up short before a tumble of boulders and thorn. Thin figures slipped between stones like fish in a stream. She saw the flare of a match, a sudden puff of smoke, and then a burst of dust in front of a horse. Not bullets, powder, noise without bite. The riders wheeled and fired back at phantoms. A movement at her elbow made her flinch. The Apache warrior slid into the notch beside her, eyes on the chaos below. He had come through the rocks as easily as wind through grass. His bow rested against one knee. He said the people were on the ridge above the canyon now, moving east, and the hired rifles were biting at bait. He nodded toward the burned-out brands and smiled without mirth. She said noise was the only thing she had more of than bullets. Said sometimes noise was all a battle needed. Below them, the spare man raised an arm and split his riders again. One line churned west after the shadows. The other swung south toward the willow flats, still sure that smoke would rise if they pressed hard enough. The warrior's face tightened. He said a child and an elder had stayed behind at the flats to gather baskets and a medicine bag they could not replace. He had told them to go, but grief is a root that will not pull free. He said he would fetch them before the rifles set fire to the reeds. He told her to stay in the rocks, to do nothing that would draw eyes to this ridge. She nodded and then reached for his forearm without thinking. The muscles there were corded like young wood under bark. He met her gaze. No words passed, but the river's sound filled the space between them like a promise. He vanished downslope, a dark-threaded stitch through sage. She watched him until he became part of the earth. Then she watched the riders, counting heartbeats between their movements. Learning their rhythm the way one learns a horse with a bad temper, she picked up a stone and tossed it into a gully to her left. A rabbit sprang, white tail flashing. A rider turned his head and shouted to another, and in that small turn the seam of the day opened. It felt like how a song changes when a single note shifts. She could see it all at once. This was how the valley might hold. But the frontier seldom gives what it teases. A crack sounded on the far ridge, clean and hard. Not powder, a rifle. The sound bounced off stone and came back thin. Another shot answered from near the river. The riders in the south line spurred hard for the flats. A smoke lifted in a faint ribbon above the reeds, not from fire, but from the churn of dust where hooves cut the shore. A hawk cried and wheeled. Heat shook the air so the riders looked like figures seen through water. The woman felt the old fear rise again, the kind that knows how quickly a day can fall apart. She wanted to run downslope, to swing a rope, a pan, a shovel, anything that would change the math. She made herself stay. The mule shifted and flicked flies. A lizard zipped over her boot and vanished. She watched the narrow mouth of the flats and waited for one figure to appear. The river hissed and hushed as if reciting a prayer. At last she saw him. The warrior broke from the reeds with the child under one arm, the elder at his back, moving in quick bursts from willow to willow. Arrows feathered the ground near his feet. Shots chased them from the far bank, where a pair of rifles had found good mark. He raised his bow without breaking stride and sent a shaft into the sand between those two guns. They flinched just enough. He pushed the child ahead and swept the elder when she stumbled, never once looking up at the riders beating toward them. The spare man stood in his stirrups and signaled. 3 riders peeled off to cut the warrior before he reached the narrow trail that climbed toward safety. Their horses ate ground fast. The woman felt the breath leave her. She lifted the hammer and hit stone until the ringing poured into the gulch like a bell that would not stop. She dragged the chains so they clattered around the rocks. She called 2 invisible hands to keep the fire going. For a heartbeat, the riders looked uphill, measuring the noise against what they saw. It was a heartbeat the warrior used. The child scrambled into the first switchback. The elder reached for a root and pulled herself up by inches. Hooves thundered below. The warrior turned between the 2 groups of riders, one coming from the south, one from the west, and did something the woman would never forget. I set his feet as if the land itself had told him where to stand. He drew the bow wide, so wide the wood creaked like a tree in wind. Time seemed to thin. The river brightened. Even the dust paused. He loosed, reached to his quiver, and loosed again, each arrow grazing a bridle or a saddle horn, breaking lines rather than bodies, forcing horses sideways into each other, snaring their own momentum against them. It was not the work of a ghost. It was the work of a man who knew how to choose what to break, so that the whole stayed whole. The riders cursed and fought their mounts back into order. The child vanished into the turn above. The elder pushed on, fierce as thorn. The warrior backed uphill without looking behind him, his eyes dark and steady as riverstone. Then the spare man leveled his rifle. Horse under him stilled in the heat. The barrel settled. The woman saw the angle, the distance, the lack of dust between them, and she knew the shot would land true. Her body moved before her mind could catch it. She swung the branding iron from the coals, red and hissing, and lifted it high on the ridge. The smell rose sharp as lightning strike. She stamped it into dry brush so smoke curled up thick and ugly, the kind that says cattle are burning. Voices behind her took the cry and carried it across the rocks, a chorus of panic she invented from nothing. The spare man's aim wavered as the false alarm rolled over his riders, as horses tossed and sidestepped, and men shouted about fire near the herd. The rifle barked a breath too late. The shot punched dust at the warrior's heel. He reached the bend and vanished from her sight. The spare man did not curse. He only set his rifle again and spoke to his men in that flat voice that could shave a coin. The riders gathered tight, anger and purpose pouring back into their shapes. They turned not after the ridge this time, but toward the river trail that would climb to the canyon rim, the very route the people had taken at dawn. The net was shifting. The old law of the valley, the one built from water and trail, was about to be tested by ledgers and guns. The woman stood with smoke in her eyes and iron in her hands, listening to the hoofbeats take a new line through the sage. She knew the day still had hours left in it, and that each would bring another choice shaped like a blade. Far below, where the current folded around a bend, she caught a last glimpse of the warrior guiding the elder along a narrow shelf of rock, the child pressed to the stone with both palms. He did not look back up to the ridge, yet she felt the weight of being seen. Wind pushed the smoke north and cleared the view to the canyon mouth, dark and waiting. The hired rifles rode hard toward it, the spare man at their head, the sheriff's deputy among them now, hat low. Badge no brighter than a coin at the bottom of a well. The river quickened its talk, as if urging the land to hurry. Somewhere out of sight, the people of the Willow Flats filed along a path as thin as a whisper. The prairie hushed, listening. The woman tightened her grip and set her feet. Whatever came next would decide more than one ranch and one camp. It would decide whether the valley remembered promises or forgot them, whether the bough kept its string or snapped under a weight no wood could bear. She felt the world gather itself like breath before speech, and knew the day had not yet reached its sharpest point. The wind carried dust from the canyon, and the sound of hoofbeats echoed faint across the valley floor. The woman stood near the ridge with her shawl clutched tight, eyes searching the horizon where the last riders had vanished. The prairie below was still, yet the silence felt like a stretched wire ready to snap. Her pulse matched the tremor in the air. Something was coming, something she could feel but not see. The smoke had cleared, but its scent lingered, sharp and bitter, mixing with fear and the iron taste of waiting. Down by the river, the Apache warrior moved through the brush, careful and soundless. He had guided the child and the elder to a hollow cut into the canyon wall where the rock hid them from sight. Now, every step he took was shadow and instinct. The wind shifted, carrying voices, men shouting to each other, spurs clinking, the rhythm of command. The rifles had spread wide. They were closing the valley from both ends, driving toward the cliffs where his people climbed. He knew the pattern well. It was the same trap the soldiers used years ago near Fort Huachuca, the same one that left his brother's body unburied under the desert sun. He crouched near a ridge of stone and watched. Through the shimmer of heat, the hired riders advanced, their coats flapping like wings of black crows. The man leading them, the one they called the foreman, now rode at the front, jaw tight, rifle resting easy across his saddle. The warrior studied him, memorizing the way he moved, the way his men followed his every signal without question. This was not just vengeance. It was habit, born from years of taking orders and giving none. Far above, the woman moved to a rocky outcrop where she could see both the ranch and the canyon mouth. The sun sat low behind her, the land glowing with that golden light that made even danger look beautiful. She could make out the faint glimmer of rifles to the south and the dust rising from the west. The two lines would meet near the narrow pass, the same place where the Apache had hidden the children. She realized what that meant. The trap would not only close around him, it would crush everyone with him. She ran back to the mule and pulled out a torn map of the old mining trails, one the ranch used years ago before the ore ran dry. There was one forgotten trail, thin and twisting, cutting above the canyon, leading east through shale and scrub. If the Apache could reach it, he could lead his people out. But he wouldn't know it was there. She mounted the mule and started down, dust biting her face, heart pounding, as if trying to warn her against what she was about to do. The first shot rang out long before she reached the valley floor. The crack rolled through the air like thunder, then another, closer. The echo bounced from rock to rock, each report blending into a storm of sound. She pushed the mule faster, ducking low as the ridge began to spit smoke. The smell of gunpowder mingled with the dry scent of sage. She could hear men yelling orders, horses screaming, the metallic clash of panic. The Apache warrior darted from cover to cover, his bow snapping silent answers to their bullets. Each arrow found its mark not in flesh, but in the ground before boots, the air beside hats, the path of advancing riders. He fought to slow them, not to kill them. His people had seen enough death. But every time he turned, more men appeared. He could feel the valley tightening around him, the noose drawing closer. Then he saw her. The woman rode down the slope, her figure small against the light. For a moment, he thought she was another trick of the dust. But she waved her arm toward the ridge, shouting something he could barely hear. He followed her gesture the old mining trail, a way out. He turned to call for the elder and the child, but the wind swallowed his voice. A bullet struck near his foot, spraying dirt into his eyes. He spun and loosed an arrow, grazing the arm of the shooter. Another shot followed, closer this time, nicking the edge of his shoulder. He fell behind a boulder, clutching the wound. The pain was sharp but clean, not deep enough to stop him. Still, blood darkened his sleeve. He pressed his palm against it, willing his body to stay strong. The woman reached him moments later, sliding from the mule, breathless. Her eyes widened at the sight of the blood. "You have to move," she said. "They're closing in from both sides." He shook his head. "The old cannot climb fast. The children. I'll help them," she cut in. "Just get them to that trail." For a second, their eyes met the same unspoken understanding as that night he stepped out of the shadows. Two people caught between worlds, neither belonging fully to one. He nodded once, then turned toward the canyon. Above them, the foreman's men fired wildly into the dust. One shouted that he saw movement by the cliffs. Another cursed the sun. The foreman raised his rifle and took aim at the mule, now standing loose in the open. The shot cracked through the air. The mule stumbled, then collapsed. The woman flinched but didn't stop. She grabbed the rifle from the saddle and ducked behind the same rock where the Apache had taken cover. "You'll get yourself killed," he said without looking at her. "I already live among the dead," she whispered. The words hit him harder than any bullet. He rose from cover and ran low, toward the canyon mouth, his shadow long against the stone. The child saw him first and waved. The elder struggled behind, one leg dragging, lifted her arm over his shoulder, and urged them forward. The woman followed, rifle in hand, firing warning shots to draw attention away from their retreat. Her aim wasn't perfect, but the sound alone bought them seconds. That meant survival. The foreman's horse reared when a bullet ricocheted off stone near its hooves. He steadied it, his face twisting with anger. Abe barked orders, sending half his men toward the ridge and the rest down into the canyon. "No one leaves that pass alive," he shouted. The echo of his voice carried all the way to the cliffs. The woman heard it, and for the first time she felt real fear, not for herself, but for the man she had come to believe in, and for the people he carried on his back. She climbed after them, the shale slipping beneath her boots, dust stinging her eyes. The trail was narrow and sharp-edged, every misstep a fall into nothing. Behind them, gunfire grew louder. The riders were closer now, their horses scrambling up the rocky slope. The Apache stopped and turned, firing his last arrow toward the narrow bend where the path forked. It hit the dirt just in front of the lead horse, causing it to rear and tumble, its rider falling with a cry. The delay bought them another breath of time. When they reached the start of the old mining trail, the woman turned to see the valley below, smoke curling, men shouting, the sun dipping low. It looked like the world had been swallowed by war. The Apache guided the elder and child into the narrow cut of the trail, hidden beneath overgrown brush. He turned back to her. "Go," he said. "You have done enough." She shook her head. "Not until they're safe." Another shot struck the rock near her shoulder, sending fragments flying. She stumbled, but he caught her arm, steadying her. "You can't stay," he said. "I can't leave either," she replied softly. He didn't argue. There wasn't time. He helped her climb higher, toward the ridge where the trail curved behind a wall of stone. Below, the foreman's men dismounted, fanning out in pairs. They moved carefully now, wary of what they couldn't see. The foreman barked another order, pointing toward the smoke still rising from the burned brush. The sun began to sink behind the western ridge, the sky turning the color of blood. Shadows stretched long across the canyon, swallowing the last of the light. The Apache and the woman reached a ledge overlooking the valley, a narrow perch where the air was thin and still. They could see the riders moving below, small figures against the endless desert. He took a deep breath, feeling the pain in his shoulders sharpen. The woman looked at him, her eyes reflecting the dim glow of dusk. "If they catch us here," she said quietly, "there won't be another chance." He nodded, tightening the leather around his wound. "Then this will be the place they remember," he said. The sound of hoofbeats drew closer again, echoing up through the stone. The woman could make out voices now angry, desperate, closing in. The child's cry carried faintly through the wind from higher on the trail. She turned to look at the Apache, but he was already drawing his bow, calm and focused, his silhouette framed against the dying light. Below, the foreman raised his rifle once more. He scanned the ridge, his eyes narrowing on the faint flicker of movement above. The shot that followed tore through the stillness like lightning. The echo rang across the valley, rolling into silence. Neither of them moved. The tension hung thick, a moment caught between life and death, light and shadow. The woman's heart pounded as the wind lifted her hair and carried the sound of the river far below. The Apache lowered his bow, but did not turn. Somewhere behind them, the child called again. The foreman reloaded. And as the first stars began to pierce the crimson sky, the valley held its breath. Something was about to break. The shot that cracked through the canyon hung in the air longer than thunder. For a breath, the world stood still. Dust drifted, a hawk screamed overhead, and even the wind forgot how to move. The woman turned sharply, her pulse hammering in her chest. The Apache stood firm against the edge of the ridge, bow still in hand, his eyes searching below. The bullet had grazed the rock behind him, splintering stone but missing its mark. Smoke rose from the foreman's rifle, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat as he chambered another round. The woman grabbed the Apache's arm, pulling him toward the narrow pass behind the ledge. "We have to go," she whispered, voice cracking from fear and dust. He hesitated only a second before nodding, leading her up the steep incline. His shoulder bled freely now, staining his chest with dark streaks that glowed faintly in the dying light. Every step sent a wave of pain through him, but his stride never faltered. Behind them, gunfire erupted again, echoing across the cliffs. Bullets struck the rock, spitting dust and sparks. The sound chased them like a curse. They reached the bend in the trail, where the canyon forked into two paths. One climbed toward the high ridge. The other twisted down toward the river. The child and the elder had already disappeared into the shadows above, safe for now. The woman turned back, her breath ragged. She could see the riders below, their torches like angry fireflies moving closer, their shouts bouncing off the walls. "They won't stop," she said quietly. "They'll keep hunting until one of us is gone." The Apache's voice was calm, though his body trembled. "Then we end it here." He drew his last arrow, tested the string with his thumb, and glanced at her once more. No more running. She wanted to argue, to tell him survival meant more than vengeance, but something in his eyes silenced her. It wasn't anger she saw there. It was passa, the kind that comes when a man knows exactly who he is and what he stands for. The first rider reached the lower ledge, gun drawn, scanning the rocks above. The Apache stepped into view, letting the moonlight touch his face. His bow lifted, smooth and sure. The rider froze. He recognized the man from the stories whispered around campfires, the ghost of the valley, the warrior who had survived every ambush and vanished like smoke. Fear flickered in his eyes, but pride drove him forward. He raised his gun. The Apache loosed the arrow, struck the rifle's barrel, knocking it aside, sending the man tumbling backward. His horse bolted, throwing the others into confusion. Chaos swept the ledge, men shouting, dust rising, torches falling. The foreman shouted for order, but his voice was lost in the noise. The woman took aim with the rifle she carried, though her hands shook. She fired once, not to kill, but to break the rope bridge that spanned the narrow section of the canyon below. The shot tore through the rope, and the bridge dropped, crashing into the rocks. It was enough. The path was cut off. The riders below were trapped. Silence followed, broken only by the sound of the river running far beneath. The Apache lowered his bow, breathing hard. The woman stood beside him, her eyes wide and wet, unsure if it was over or just paused. Below, the foreman climbed to his feet. His hat was gone, his face streaked with dust and rage. He raised his rifle once more, aiming higher this time. The Apache saw the motion, but had no arrow left. He stood still, the wind stirring his hair, his gaze fixed on the man below. Then the rifle cracked again. The woman lunged without thinking, pushing the Apache back as the shot rang out. The bullet struck the rock beside her, cutting her arm, but she didn't stop. She grabbed his hand, pulling him up the final rise toward the top of the ridge. Together they climbed until the world below fell away into the dark. By the time they reached the summit, the sky had turned deep blue, and the first stars had begun to shimmer. The air was thin and cold. From up there the valley looked endless vast, wild and beautiful, untouched by the noise of men. They collapsed near a cluster of boulders, both gasping for breath. The woman tore a strip from her skirt and pressed it against his wound. He winced, but said nothing. "Oh, they won't follow now," she said softly, watching the faint glow of torches fade below. He nodded slowly. "They will not forget either." The words hung heavy, but she understood. The land didn't forget, not here. Every drop of blood spilled on this soil became part of its memory. The rivers carried it, the winds told it, and someday the children would whisper it by their fires. When dawn came, the sky burned with color red at the horizon, soft gold above. The child and the elder appeared again, climbing down from the higher path. The boy ran to the Apache, throwing his arms around him. The elder placed a hand on the woman's shoulder and whispered words she didn't know, but somehow felt. The Apache rose slowly, steadying himself. His eyes moved across the valley, taking in every hill, every line of shadow. "This land will heal," he said finally. The woman looked at him, uncertain. "Then for who?" "For those who remember both sides," he said. "For those who choose not to hate." She followed his gaze, toward the river that wound through the canyon. It glittered under the rising sun, endless and free. For the first time in a long while, she felt something close to peace. The fear that had followed her since that night at the ranch began to loosen its hold. They buried the weapons near the ridge's bow, her rifle marking the spot with a flat stone. It wasn't surrender, only a promise. The woman turned toward the east, where the plains stretched out toward the horizon. She would head there, she said. Find a small town, maybe a job at the telegraph station. Somewhere she could live without walls closing in. He listened, then nodded. "The east has room for the weary," he said. "The west keeps the restless." She smiled faintly. "And you?" He looked down at the valley one last time. "Go where the land remembers me." The wind rose again, tugging at their clothes, carrying the scent of sage and the distant sound of running water. They stood together a moment longer, two souls bound by a story larger than either of them. Then he turned and walked toward the canyon's far edge, where the trail disappeared into shadow. She watched him go until he became part of the landscape, until there was nothing left but the rustle of wind and the cry of a hawk circling high above. When she finally turned away, the sun had climbed high enough to warm the rocks. She began the long walk east, her steps slow but certain. The land stretched before her, vast and open. The same land that had taken so much, and yet still offered something in return. Hope, perhaps, or forgiveness. As she walked, she thought of the people who would tell this story some days, the ranchers who would claim it as legend, the natives who would speak of it as truth. Each would tell it differently, but the heart of it would remain the same. One night, when mercy stood against hate, when a bow and a heart outlasted bullets and pride, by midday, the ridge was far behind her. The wind carried whispers from the canyon, faint and steady, like the hum of an old song. She didn't look back. The valley no longer belonged to her or to anyone. It belonged to the earth again. And somewhere out there, beyond sight, the Apache walked beneath the same sun. Following a river that remembered every step, the land, scarred and silent, would heal in time. The fences would fall, the trails would fade, but the story would remain woven into the wind, carved into the stone, living in the memory of those who dared to stand between darkness and dawn. The prairie stretched ahead, wild and endless. She took one last deep breath, the kind that fills the chest and clears the soul, and kept walking, eastward, whatever waited beyond the horizon, carrying with her the memory of the man who had stepped from the shadows with his bow drawn, the promise he had kept when no one else would.